Hi everyone, thank you for coming to Lines and Minds, our very exciting workshop. So we're very happy to spend this afternoon together, thinking about abstraction, drawings, and visual communication. And from early cave paintings to modern maps, diagrams, and icons, humans have always found ways to distill the visual world into lines, shapes, and symbols. But probably all of you here were wondering, why and how do people abstract? And what makes a simplification effective? And what does that mean for the tools we build in computer graphics, in interfaces, and recently in AI? And today we'll discuss all of these questions in our workshop. And we'll have two parts for the workshop. In the first part, we'll have Aaron Hertzmann and Rubaiat Habib, and they will discuss how people produce and perceive visual abstraction and its role in the creative process. Then we'll have a short break, and in the second part, we'll have Tversky and McCloud, and they will discuss abstraction as a tool for thought and communication. So I want to thank our amazing speakers who made the effort coming here, the organizing team, which include Mia Tang, Judy Fan, Manisha Gawala, Kartik Chandra, and myself, and also Aaron. And thanks to Adobe and Rev, our generous sponsors, and of course to SIGGRAPH for having us here. Without further ado, I want to present our first speaker, Aaron Hertzmann. Aaron is a principal scientist at Adobe Research and an affiliate professor at the University of Washington. He's an ACM and IEEE Fellow, and the recipient of the 2024 SIGGRAPH Computer Graphics Achievement Award. Aaron has a rare background spanning computer science and art. He pioneered foundational techniques in non-photorealistic animation and rendering, image synthesis, character animation, and he has developed new theories of perception, perspective, and line drawing. And I'm personally a big fan of Aaron, so welcome, Aaron Hertzmann.
So I'm going to talk about how we draw pictures. So this is work that is based on a paper that Judy and I wrote. It's recently been accepted to a psychology journal. So this is a talk mainly about psychology and vision and how they influence drawing processes. And I'll start with a question. What do you think is the most creative art technology? So it's a subjective question, there's no right or wrong answer, but my answer for me is a pencil, or brushes, or styluses in general. And with drawing with styluses, higher? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So with styluses, with drawing, you can do all sorts of things. You can do detailed technical illustration. You can doodle and brainstorm and have ideas and just mess around. Anyone can pick up a pen. We all learn to draw as kids. And we could also draw realistically. We can draw from life as an observational drawing in the studio or out in the world. And yet, so many people will say, I can't draw. And this is really unfortunate. The psychologists have studied for many years why this is. Why is it most people can't draw what they see? So there's been several decades of research on this question or other versions of it. And the thing is that most of this psychology research has studied copying tasks. So a participant comes into the lab, they are given a drawing or a photograph, and their job is to make as precise a copy of that photo or drawing as they can. So for example, in that paper I just showed you briefly a moment ago, participants were shown this photo, and some were allowed to trace over the photo, and others were asked to draw it from reference. And these particular authors concluded that because people are able to trace pretty accurately, motor skills are not a limiting factor in people's ability to draw. It has something to do with people's perceptual abilities. That's what they thought. So this whole body of psychology research has asked, why is drawing hard, and what separates artists from non-artists? So as we've begun doing this literature review and studying this work, my first response in reading all the papers is that art isn't about copying. Being an artist isn't about being able to make precise copies of pictures. Because if you did, if that's all you wanted, you would just take a photograph. But the more we sort of thought about it and talked about it and read through the literature, we thought, actually there is a lot of useful information we can get from these kinds of studies. And so this is what I want to talk to you about. what do we learn from these copying studies? And we're going to propose here a new way of understanding the copying process that will inform how people draw pictures. In the second part of the talk, I'm also going to switch gears a little bit to talk about creativity and talk about how the copying process relates to being creative. Now, of course, there are many other skills and issues involved in drawing, where you draw lines, which lines do you draw, perspective and style and expression and motion. These things I'm not going to talk about here, but I'll refer you to our paper at the end if you want to see. We survey a lot of these topics in the paper itself. And I think that if we were able to formulate better theories and better understanding of how people draw pictures, we could formulate more in-depth cognitive models of drawing, we could make better tools to help people draw pictures, and we could even improve art education by if we have a better understanding of what exactly are the skills that people can learn and what they can practice. So let's imagine an artist drawing a picture. So what do? You might imagine, or one could imagine, that an artist looks at the source and they want to copy a picture of. They form a mental representation of that source. They look at the page, and then they draw a picture from that mental representation. So is that what artists do? Here's Henri Matisse drawing a portrait of his grandson, and you can see that he is continually looking back and forth between his grandson, between the page. He doesn't just do that cartoon I drew of look at the grandson and then never look back again, only look at the page. He's continually looking back and forth. So why is that? Why are we continually looking back and forth when we draw pictures or when we copy pictures? And our claim in this paper is that this is because of something we're calling the vision memory bottleneck, that limitations on our vision and our visual memory sharply constrain how we can copy pictures. So for example, here's a little very rough sketch of a tree. Now I'll take the picture away, and then I'll ask you how many leaves were there on that tree. And if you could memorize the picture and the whole picture was downloaded into your head, then it should be an easy question to answer, and I don't think it will be. Whereas obviously if you have the picture in front of you, it should be an easy question. So this is a limitation of visual memory. We don't just scan the world into our heads, we don't just photograph things and store pixels. We have much more abstracted mental representations of what we look at. The second important limitation is, I'll illustrate here, so stare at the red dot, and while staring at the red dot, again, try to count the leaves. And again, I don't think you can do it, or it's difficult if you're not allowed to move your eyes. And if you do move your eyes, feel free, then of course it's much easier to see to count the leaves. So this points to limitations of peripheral vision. So as you may know, we get most of visual detail in the direction we're looking in foveal vision. The rule of thumb for the size of foveal vision is that you hold out your thumb at arm's length, and the width of your thumb is the visual extent of foveal vision. It's about 1 to 5 degrees of visual angle, depending on which definition you use. Everything else is peripheral vision. So 99.9% of the visual field of what you look at any moment is peripheral vision, and it has much lower acuity, and we get much less detail from peripheral vision. And when I took this photo, that illustration on the right is roughly what I could see with my foveal vision. So the limitation of peripheral vision is we just get much less detail in periphery, and so we have to move our eyes to gather information from the scene. And so this is illustrated by this picture. This contains 2 concentric rings, but if you fixate on any part of the picture, you can see that where you're looking, you can see the rings are separate. In peripheral vision, they're always entangled. And no matter how much you move your eyes around the picture here, that illusion never goes away. So if it were the case that you were building up a mental representation of the whole picture, at some point you should just know there's 2 rings there and never have to look back and never be confused by the illusion, but that never happens. So these limitations, how little information you get from a single view and how little information you can store in mental representations, this is what we're calling the vision memory bottleneck. There's very little information you can gather to store and transfer to the picture before you have to go back to the well and get more information. And so like in the words of David Hockney, the artist, he says that when you draw from the eye, you're drawing from memory. Every time you look at the page to draw, it's a memory of what you might have just seen 5 seconds ago or 10 seconds ago or a minute ago. And indeed, in one study, they found that people who are trained artists move their eyes back and forth to do a copying task more frequently. So in this case, it was 4 seconds, back and forth every 4 seconds for the novice versus every 2 seconds for the professional. So we're currently in the process of doing a follow-up study to sort of tease apart, the limitations here. This is with David Toms. It'll be a summer project right now. And what we're going to do is we are showing people a short curve segment, and then it goes away, and then we ask them to draw a copy of the curve segment you just saw. And then they draw a copy. And we're already finding in preliminary pilots that it's just even a few curve segments make it very difficult to make a precise copy. So you can really only get a little bit of at a time if you want to be really precise in your copy. Now, you don't just have to look at the source, you have to look at the target. What happens if you don't look at the drawing as you're doing? And basically what happens is you lose track of where your pen is with respect to everything else you draw. You just can't remember that. So this is an example of a blind drawing that I drew in a creativity workshop. And so basically, the exercise is draw the person to your right while holding, without looking at the page and without lifting your hand. You have 30 seconds. And so in my drawing here, you see what's typical in a lot of these blind drawings. That, like, I started out with a profile of the nose and lips, and they're reasonable drawings of those. But then the scale and the positioning of later elements, kind of gets out of whack. So when I came back to draw her hairline, I had no idea where my pen was with respect to what I'd already drawn, and so I ended up drawing it through her eyes. And we can see some of these phenomena in eye tracking studies. So this is from a sequence of papers by Chalenko et al., where you have people drawing while tracking their eyes. And the black rectangle here shows the eyes of the artist, where she's looking. And you can see she's moving her eyes back and forth between where she's drawing from and where she's drawing to. But there's something interesting, which is more subtle than what I originally described going on here that they point out in these papers. Specifically, if we slow it down, there are times when she is looking at the source and drawing on the target. These brief moments of blind drawing. So right now she's looking at the source, but curves drawing appears in the target. So there's actually moments of doing this back and forth. And in fact, when I read these papers, I thought I'd not heard of it before, and I thought, I wonder if I did that. So I sat down and drew a picture, and I realized, so at times when I look up and down, and look up, look down, draw, but there are other times where, right here, where my hand is moving, I'm drawing at the same time while my eyes are going up and down. And I had no idea was doing this until I read about it and then tried it myself. And so this speaks to the value of studies that are observing people's actual practices rather than trying to infer or guess or introspect about what people are doing. Another interesting question is, what is the form of the mental representation people have? So what do you store in your head in between looking at the source and drawing a curve? One might imagine that you store a copy of the picture, that you download pixels of the region you're looking at. But obviously that's a little bit inefficient. That maybe it makes more sense to draw, to remember the curve you're going to draw. And in fact, in studies by Chalenko et al., they found that evidence for this, that people are actually storing the curves, that the motor regions of the brain of drawing are being activated at the time of vision. So, and this makes sense, it's more efficient to store the curves. And in fact, I've found myself, I'm looking at, I'm imagining the curves I would draw when looking at a picture. So this is a more efficient mental representation. So our answer to the question of why is it hard to draw pictures is, at least in part, the vision memory bottleneck. You can't just copy a picture into the head and then copy it onto the page. So the secondary question there is, what makes people good at copying pictures? And there's a few possible answers to this question that people have studied in the psychology literature. It could be that people are better at copying pictures because they have better perception. Maybe trained artists have more receptors in their retina or better shape processing systems in their brains. It could be that people who are more skilled at, or who are better at drawing pictures, have learned better skills. And I've already alluded a little bit to how you can learn the skill of drawing, learning to go back and forth and draw, or this process of transferring information is a skilled process. And it could also be that we have people who draw more accurately, have more knowledge of the world, of how things look. And I think all these things could be true. I'm a little skeptical of the first one, of assigning talent to innate skill. I think that these, as I mentioned, we can learn these skills of drawing. All right, I haven't mentioned much, but like I think the skills of transfer strokes are things we can practice and learn. So I'm going to talk about a little bit how knowledge can be helpful. I'm just going to give a few examples to illustrate some points. In the literature, people often talk about whether knowledge is good or bad. And this might come in part from the 19th century art critic John Ruskin, who advocated that artists should try to simulate their innocent eye and record perception precisely. Or the French philosopher Lequet, who wrote that novices don't draw accurately because they draw what they know and not what they see. That, for example, they're not drawing the nose in front of them, they're drawing the knowledge of the nose. And clearly there's some truth to this. And here I want to argue that knowledge of the world can compensate for the vision memory bottleneck by replacing some visual comparisons that happen during the drawing process. By visual comparisons, I'm talking about things like this children's book thing where like you have to try to count all the different differences between two pictures. You can do it, but because of limitations of visual memory and peripheral vision, it takes a lot of time to do all the visual comparisons. Likewise, when you're drawing a picture. So the right is the partway through drawing a sketch of this dog I took a photo of, and at every point when I'm drawing a picture like this, at some point I have to decide what am I going to do next. Am I going to change the stuff I've already done? Am I going to work on one part or another? If you wanted to make a precise copy, you would continually be visually comparing the right side and the left side, but as we've seen, visual comparisons are slow. And throughout the entire process, you have this continual need to make the decisions about comparison between the pictures, but comparisons are slow. So knowledge can help replace the need for some of the visual comparisons between the source and target. And I'll give one example of that. One useful tidbit of information is that a person's eyes are typically about halfway between the top of their head and the bottom of their head. And that, I don't know where I learned this, but I learned it years ago drawing. And I will tell you, this is really easy to get drawn. I draw a sketch of a person and their eyes are like up here. It just seems to happen automatically. And what's more, there are studies showing that if you tell novices this fact before they copy a sketch of a person, they will get the proportions more accurately. So it's actually, knowing this helps novices improve their drawing ability. And one interesting thing is that the position of the eyes tends to depend on the hairline. So people who are bald tend to get the eyes a little higher, if you're not paying attention to this fact. Case in point, here's a drawing I was just sketching a speaker at a conference a few months ago. In the middle of the sketch, I look down at my drawing and I see the top of this guy's head is like way too close to his eyes. And I know that because I know this fact about the eyes being in the middle of the head. And so in the middle of the drawing, I was able to see, without visual comparison to the speaker, that there's this thing and I have a choice, do I want to change it? And so in this case, I did erase, go back, and then move his head up so there's enough room for his brain. And so it makes the proportions, I think, look a little better. And in fact, these kinds of bits of knowledge can be codified in drawing practice. And you don't have to work this way, but there's lots of people who do. So for example, this is a technique from a 17th century drawing instruction book, where the way you draw a head is you draw a circle, draw a cross in the circle wherever you want the eye gaze to be, and then draw the rest of the features around that cross. And here's an example of the Renaissance painter Paolo Veronese using this technique in sketches in preparation for paintings. In the 20th century, we can see more and more sophisticated versions of this rule. This is a drawing book by Andrew Loomis from the 1950s, and he has the all-important cross in the ball, but he has more pieces for all the different facial features and more elaborate constructions to get the details more precise. If you ever look at books on how to draw comics, you see all these elaborate constructions of first get the gesture and then the volumes and then draw in the details. I'll say, I never learned these or I never practiced these techniques. I find them kind of intimidating, and again, you don't have to learn these things. To me, they all feel like this online parody, which you might have seen. First, draw some circles, then draw the rest of the owl. And you don't need to learn these things from books. You can do what I did and just try to just observe them for practice. So, here's another. I like to draw dogs from the shelter where I volunteer. There's one thing about this drawing that to me feels unrealistic. Obviously, there's lots that's unrealistic. I don't expect you to figure out what I'm thinking of. But specifically here, it's the fact that dogs' nostrils have slits in the side. And there's no reason why you should know this if you don't hang out with a lot of dogs. But I observed this after lots of observation. and then later learned that it's because dogs are really sensitive to smell. They breathe in air to the front, breathe out to the side, so that the incoming air smells won't be corrupted. And I think that if you draw the dog with the correct nostrils or reasonable nostrils, then it does look, I think, more dog-like. Even if you're not attending to it, I think a viewer will see that as being more dog-like, whether or not you're noticing that difference. So I primarily talked about copying pictures, and I don't think copying is a very creative task, but I think as I indicated, it can be a starting point for creativity. And in fact, I want to make a claim, which is that drawing is more creative because of the vision memory bottleneck. This is not meant to be a scientific claim, this is more provocative, like what if, here's an interesting idea kind of claim. Now to say what I mean, I need to talk about what creativity, and there's two myths of creativity I think are really common. One is that creativity can't be taught, you have to be a brilliant artist to be creative. And the other myth is that the way an artist works is that they have a vision and then they execute on that vision. And in that view, creativity all happens in the vision and then in the idea and then being creative, and then the rest of the process is just doing the grunt work. And one experience I've had over and over again is I start drawing a picture and the picture ends up as not what I expected. I had no idea that the drawing would look like this when I started. I mean, I knew it would be a dog, but the particular personality and character of it was, I had no idea where it was going. And the more I've read works from artists and other creative people, the more I see them all describe creativity this way. Picasso said, I don't know in advance what I'm going to put on canvas. Each time I undertake to paint a picture, I have a sensation of leaping into space. And I just can't imagine that he knew this painting was going to look like that when he started out. It's kind of an improvisation. In fact, I've found so many different examples of this in different artists, musicians, writers, mathematicians, that I collected a bunch of examples of them on this webpage. Now, we can also be very creative even if we're not professionals. So here, there's lots of creativity exercises to practice this. This is one from Linda Berry that she gives to her students at the University of Wisconsin called Close Your Eyes and See Me. You set your timer for 1 minute, then close your eyes and draw a bacon and egg breakfast with coffee, toast, and silverware. And so this comes out. Do it again, draw a mermaid, a giraffe with spots, a Statue of Liberty, mermaid, giraffe with spots, Statue of Liberty. And each of these drawings, I think made by a novice undergrad, as it were, has some personality and some character that surely they did not plan this in advance. If you do this, you're going to have something there that has a particular feel that came out of it that's unexpected. And she writes, we tend to laugh as we do this exercise and laugh harder when we open our eyes, surprised by what we see. So I think this is a nice rule of thumb. Certainly in my experience, I think creativity is what happens when you surprise yourself. If you do a thing and that it came out exactly the way you planned, then that wasn't a really creative thing to do. When I was in high school and college, there's an activity called Telephone Dictionary we used to love to do. Maybe you've done something like this, but I want to step you through an example. And I don't expect it to be nearly as fun for you to hear about as it was to do. You'll have to take my word for it. But hopefully you'll get a sense. So the first person who, and this is like, this is when we were at college, not artists or anything. The first person's job is to write a sentence, any sentence they want, at the top of a piece of paper. The next person's job is to illustrate that sentence. So here, my roommate drew this picture, which is, okay, we got the hills, we got, and then to illustrate silence, we have a microphone, which has a 0 level on it. We fold over the piece of paper, and the next person's job is to describe the picture. And so in this case, the person wrote, someone who can't be seen is in rolling hills and dreaming of a microphone hooked up to a VU meter. So now the balloon on the right has become someone's dream. We do it again and just keep repeating. So the next person has to illustrate this sentence, and now the invisible person is drawing with dashed lines. The next person has to describe this picture. And now the person has become Julie Andrews thinking about this kind of music. Maybe the arms kind of look like nun flaps or something. And we, in the end, we finally end up with the fourth wise man found himself alone in the desert, but didn't despair as he kept the time in his head while making sand angels in a dew. So we started with that, sitting on the top, and we ended up with whatever that is in the bottom. And nobody planned this, nobody said, this is what we're going to do to make this whole work. It just came out of our process of pushing, having these like weird responsibilities that we give each other and seeing what happens. So let's come to copying and drawing. Now, again, I feel like just copying is really boring. So the picture on the right, I drew it tracing over the one on the left. I don't feel like the drawing adds much to the picture, and also is really boring to do. Whereas here, again, there's lots going on in the drawing on the right that is different from the source. And it feels very paradoxical to me, because like when I draw a picture on the right, I am trying my best to make a precise replica of the source, at least for a while. And yet I feel like all the ways in which I fail to achieve that goal are the things that make the drawing interesting or unique. Here's another example, another situation. So this is a sketch I did in a cafe of two people who are also in the cafe. And a picture like this gives you the impression that this is a snapshot, a brief moment in time. And yet, as we discussed, our brains can't take mental snapshots in the way a camera does. And what's actually happening here is like, so I draw a person's face, you know, I look at it, I see the face, I draw a person's face, and I look up, and the person has shifted her weight, or like lifted her arm, or whatever. And now I have to either draw her arm the new way it is and fit it with the weight, what I've already drawn, or wait for her to shift her weight again, or whatever. And so the picture like this ends up being a space-time composite of different things at different times, and sometimes just making stuff up to try to fit it in together in a way that maybe is more interesting than a snapshot. Another thing I like to do is look out the window of airplanes and draw what I see out there. And it's another case where every time I look up at the drawing, the situation has changed. So you just cannot try to capture a snapshot of a moment in time. And what the drawing in the end up just being, you know, a composite of like things I saw, things I could have seen, stuff I just made up. Or like draw one landform and then, okay, I see another landform that kind of goes next to it. And these drawings, these really rough sketches end up being impressions or like just kind of rough, almost abstract art versions of things I could have seen. It just feels like a fun exercise to making something unpredictable. And so that's what I mean when I say the vision memory bottleneck makes drawing more creative. If you could copy things precisely and you just did that, that would not be very creative. But because you can't do that, you're forced to make something new. Finally, I just want to mention how some of these ideas could be helpful for learning to draw and for drawing exercises. And I'll just point to one exercise which comes with the book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, that a lot of people have learned from. In this exercise, you are given this line drawing, and in one version, you just have to copy it right side up, and novices, tend to have lots of, inaccuracies in the proportions. Another version, you turn the drawing right upside down, and it turns out, apparently, that people will make much more precise, inaccurate copies, people without any drawing experience, when they're copying upside down. So why is that? And so the interesting question is what's going on here? Edwards, the author of the book, writes that it's because the left brain can't name objects in the upside down picture, so the right brain takes over. So there's a bunch of pseudoscience mumbo jumbo there about left brain, right brain, that just doesn't really make much sense. But there may be some core truth underneath it. Okay, well, so what does the psychology literature say? Well, there's just been one or two studies on this, and they say actually it doesn't improve drawing accuracy. So that's weird. They're saying the opposite of what Edwards is saying from all of her experience in years of working with art students. In this paper, well, they were only actually asking people to trace from photographs of faces, which are a really different class from the example I showed before. So basically, there's not enough information in the literature to really say conclusively as to why upside down drawing helps. But we can formulate a theory, which is that this exercise, when you're drawing upside down, it forces you to spend more time looking and to use what you see rather than your knowledge of what a face looks like or what a nose looks like. So I think the previous statements make sense, but the vision memory bottleneck provides a more precise framework for doing these studies to think about, let's do eye tracking, let's see like how people are actually copying differently in one way versus the other. And finally, I know there's a lot of people here who like to draw or love to draw, but there may be people who don't or think they can't draw. And I just want to say, I think everyone ought to be able to learn to draw, and it really just takes a few things. So here's Chathachan Rajasugran, who was at the time a PhD student in computer science in Berkeley. He, one day on his own, he picked up that Loomis book that I mentioned and started practicing some of the exercises on drawing faces. And within, this is 3 days later, he was drawing portraits of other grad students that were pretty good for someone who just started 3 days ago. And so it's really just a lot about practicing. It's a skill like any other skill that you can learn. You just have to stop telling yourself, I can't draw or I'm no good, take classes or do exercises in books that will like push you to try different things and do different exercises. And it's practice, practice, practice. And if you're like me, at some point, once you start doing it, it's just like addictive. You're not going to want to stop. And finally, I think it's really important to find your support group, people who will give you positive feedback and reinforce you, because I really think art is a very social activity. So to summarize, our main theory or proposal in the paper is that the reason drawing is hard, especially the reason copying is hard, is because of our visual limitations of our visual memory and limitations of our peripheral vision. And so we can't just take visual snapshots of the world. We have to copy information piece by piece. And the skills and the strategies that artists use to do observational drawing involve this kind of what's called gaze shift of look, draw a little bit, look and draw a little bit, and so on. Knowledge can help reduce our need to look at the source. We can evaluate information on the page without visual comparisons. And I think that creativity is a lot about making something new and not copying, but copying can be a starting point for creativity. Finally, most of the psychology research I mentioned looks at copying pictures in a lab, and I think that there's an opportunity to study how do people do real observational drawing in life, because there's not much of this in the research. I'll just conclude by pointing the citation. This is the paper that I mentioned that we wrote that this talk is based on. And also, a lot of the gaze shift stuff and the videos I showed are from the work of John Telenko and Chris Miel. This is a review paper that summarizes a lot of that work, and the videos are from their video. Finally, I'm giving another talk that's related to this on Thursday morning at the Human Vision to Machine Vision workshop. And this talk will be about how visual memory limitations and peripheral vision limitations determine the way we approach perspective. So if you've ever wondered why linear perspective doesn't quite do the right thing, or what do artists do instead of using just strictly linear perspective, then I hope you'll come to the talk and learn more about that thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. We have time for one question. So, yeah, I will bring the mic to you, okay? One quick question.
Okay, I'll ask you one big question. So you said copying kind of isn't in sync with creativity. What about photography? How does that fit into this story?
So these are all fuzzy. This is more like, I'm not doing formal mathematical definitions. Creativity, photography clearly is creative when you're selecting subjects, selecting camera settings and zoom and all that stuff. I think because photography isn't just copying either, because there are all these choices in photography, and both how you picture, and even the design of the camera itself includes all these choices to a map angle, lenses and stuff like that. So there is no picture until you take a photograph, and part of that is the design of the camera, and part of that are the photographer's choices. And I have a whole other paper called "The Hidden Choices Hidden in Photography," which discusses that.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much. Excited to introduce our next speaker, Rubaiat Habib Kazi. Up until recently, Rubaiat was a senior research scientist at Adobe Research, where he designed creative tools that help people express, think, and communicate in new ways. For more than a decade, he has led a development of tools that reached millions, including Autodesk Sketchbook Motion, the first motion feature in Adobe Fresco, and the motion lines and secondary effects in Adobe Character Animator, work that was part of the 2019 Emmy Engineering Award. His papers have been recognized with 8 Best Paper Awards and Honorable Mention Awards. Rubaiat also is an animator himself. He likes to draw and write comics. And he is now leading a growing community around dynamic abstraction, which highly relates to the topic of this workshop. So I'm very excited to have you here with us. So please welcome Rubaiat.
All right, thank you so much. This is such an exciting time to be a creator. I know many of you have many ideas, thoughts, concerns, excitement about where the technology is heading, how creativity is changing, and how things should look like. So I'm excited to have this conversation and participate with you throughout the week. And I also would like to thank the organizers because this is such an important topic. This relates to how our language and thinking will evolve with powerful technological features. So the authors of this, my co-speakers and organizers have inspired me in many ways. I would like to start with a short story. When I was in my last year of PhD thesis, I was reading Scott's Understanding comics book at the library, and then I went back to my supervisor and said, I would like to write my PhD as a thesis, the comic book. And he was very excited, and he said, you should do it. I thought about it, and I felt like that's a very terrible idea, because you have to edit the thesis many times. Next day I went to him and I said, no, I think it's a bad idea. But he said, if you want to graduate, you have to do it that way. So there it is. There's my PhD thesis inspired by Scott's comic books. That's me 10 years ago, and that's me now. I have a new blue t-shirt, as you can see. I'd also like to consider myself as a creator and artist. In the early days of my PhD, I was very inspired about how artists think and create languages, like 12 principles of animation. Those were human languages, basically. Our animators developed those languages to communicate between themselves. And this specific book, Elemental Magic, which is a book very close to my heart, was written by Joseph Gallant. In this book, he talked about how he developed these tools, cognitive tools, in pen and paper, to design hand-drawn stylized animation effects. So that's why whenever we see these hand-drawn effects, they have character, they have style, because they're manually created and they were created, these tools. And at the end of the book, he had a reflection in that time, 90s, introduction of computer animation tools. The new generation of animators were losing that style and that way of thinking, like developing new tools, developing new ways of thinking and controlling animation, because they were using softwares that are written by others, like engineers and scientists. So while empowering, they could create more contents, but they were losing that way of thinking, that way of creativity, developing own taste and style. So we cannot let that happen again in this new technological revolution. So I always believe that creators should be able to manipulate their own tools using their preferred mode of representation. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. But for a long time, it was very challenging because software developers and the way software was built with rigid interfaces, we had very little creative freedom in terms of how we like to think, what are the type of abstractions, because all those things were predefined with how software is built. Now, what's exciting about these new AI tools or vibe coding is that now creators can create their own tools, like Google's AI Studio. Creators can create their own workflow, like Figma just released generative plugins, which is also very exciting in the near term. I think this is some exciting development of how creators can create their own tools. Notion can create generative AI agents, again, personalized tools. But again, we now can create our own tools, but there are, as Barbara will talk about, we think in motions and space and relationship and actions, right? But the way, again, we are thinking about tools are limited by how we communicate with these powerful AI tools, which is writing and prompting, sometimes multimodal, but primarily the writing, as well as, programming as an underlying substrate. So these are powerful languages, but they're good for one thing, bad for one thing, like any other representation. So how can we leverage visual and spatial thinking to build our own tools, to create our new, our preferred abstractions? So let's take a look at some examples of notations. There are experts in this room that have talked a lot about notations, the characteristics of notations, but simply, Notations are a way of thinking. It combines pictorial thinking and symbolic thinking. It has the intuitiveness of pictures, but it is abstract enough that it helps us to reason, right? So that's why notations are a very powerful tool for thinking for many disciplines. Now, I always wonder, like, how would the new notation development would look like in powerful computational tools, right? For that, let's take a look at a specific domain, which is animation. In animation, notations are widely used. Animation is a very, very expressive domain. It's not about how things move. It's all the nuances and details, it's like how the animation should feel like, what the timing should feel like, what is the emotion, what is the style. There are so many nuances, and you need a very powerful and expressive language to express and think through all those details. But while these notations are a powerful cognitive tools for animators in the past, few decades, we don't have any computational tools for that, because these notations are also very personal. They're abstract. They have many different meanings. Different animators use them in different way. So unlike many notations, they are not formalized. They're informal. They are also ambiguous. They are also combinatorial. So we looked at what if we could take these notation practices that are very common and then leverage them as computational tools, like reify them as instruments that we can manipulate with, right? So that's the question we wanted to ask in this notational animation paper. So what we did is once the users draw some notations, so this is a picture, a user sketches some notations. This is how I like this to move. We translate them into structural representation. And in this case, there's an automatic AI system that tries to group them, tag them. Is this what you mean? This is change of postures, this is change of hands. Is this what you mean? So it translates, it comes up with an intent, and this is the structural representation. And then again, there's a two-way editing interface where users can say, okay, this is what I meant, or you can always edit it. And then further down the line, all these tags are translated into low-level animation primitives. For instance, the hand movement, right? It is translated into two low-level primitives in the right side. One is for hand movement, and other one is for the hand wave. So it adds all these nuanced details that it thinks is useful. But you can always say, I don't want the hand to move. I only want the wave. I only want the hand to move. So this is how the interface looks in action. Static drawing, draw some notations, very free form. It's a non-modal interface. There is no modal mode. Users can use any colors. And then these are being translated into these high-level tags that the animators can look at and verify whether the intent is captured properly. And then these high-level tags and groups are translated into these timeline blocks. And then for each of the tag, as I said, there's a structure, which is like source, target, and how the movement. This is a very specific type of structure. You cannot capture all the types of animation with that structure. You can capture some animations using this structure. And then, the users is now refining the intent. Okay, I want a bit of squash, and I want, the timing should change. And then you see it's being, the interactive tools are being changed accordingly. And then again, now I don't want the animations to happen in sequence. I want some sort of overlap between the motion. Now the keyframes are being generated. Essentially, all these animation blocks in the timeline, you see are big, large prompts that are used to create these keyframes. Now, again, someone can say, okay, there's too much lean. I want less lean or more lean. All these interfaces are generated on the fly, depending on the context and user intention. Now, this is the refined keyframe. And then, again, the animator is incrementally, iteratively drawing more notations, creating more tools, and then refining the timeline. But you can see the notation is multimodal, right? And this is how the animation looks like. On the left side is the drawn notation. On the right side is like, the resulting animation. So what's interesting is if you draw parallel between textual interactions and notational interactions, right? The beauty of text-based, language-based interaction is that we can express an idea with varying levels of expression, abstraction. We can say something very little, like generate me a picture, or we can give it a lot of description, being very precise. And that's what we observed, like when we did a user study with Animator. Sometimes they did provided very little instructions, sometimes they provided a lot of instructions, sometimes they provided like very concrete, sometimes it's very abstract, sometimes it's like overview first, details later, sometimes it's the opposite. So it's the flexibility of interacting with computers, with notations that are user-defined and contextual, but at the same time, these notations are turned into computational tools that we can interact with. Now, we had talked about notations, we have talked about notational thinking, which is a way of thinking combining, symbolic and iconic representations, which are leveraging, metaphors and embodied cognitions, turning them into computational tools. But how can we make personal tools, right? What we have seen is a system that the user can use, but I'm talking about now I have that system, I want to build something very personal that fits my needs and interests. That's where the real question is. So again, when we look at many animation domains, we can see variety of styles and expressions in terms of motion, timing, emotion, all the nuances, details, physics. Every animator's world have different physical parameters. So how to develop personal tools and models, I think it's an open research questions. I won't get into that, but I'd like to show a very specific example. Imagine I want to use notation for like fine tune or like edit notation to create something very specific, which is like fluid-like dynamic animation. So in this case, I will refer back to the book, which was written long ago. He had a specific way of thinking and expressing animation, and that inspired our work. This work was almost 10 years ago as well. But when we tried to build tools by taking inspiration from that book, it was very challenging because we were trying to leverage physics-based simulation to create this type of looping animation, dynamic animations, fluid-like animations. At that time, my colleague Yostem pointed out to this paper which looked at fluid simulation by breaking them into these simple, understandable, composable primitives. So we took inspiration from that structure and then we created our own grammar and structure and abstraction to create a tool where you have these brushes. That brushes has these small atomic energy particles that have their own fluid fields. You can manipulate them just like direct manipulation, change the parameters and see the effect immediately. And then you can combine the brushes in creative ways to create complex animation. Let's take a look at this example. This is, again, simple, repeatable patterns. And then changing the parameters a little bit. And then now I want to add more complexity in an interactive, iterative way. And as I'm adding more complexity, different type of brushes, it creates noise and energy. But it's understandable because everything is created in an interactive, iterative way. Right? So to me, this is an example of personal tools. A tool, a grammar, an abstraction that is designed for a very specific task, for a very specific tile. And in the past, system designers would do it, but I hope in the future, users and creators should be able to design these abstractions and grammars. So essentially, this is the system design, right? You have these high-level strokes. It doesn't have the same structural representations that we have shown in the previous project. It has a different structural representation because on different set of abstraction, It has these atomic particles that has their own purposes. There was like few predefined one, but you can create your own one. But they have a very specific technical goal, which is like it has to be incompressible and divergence free. And so there are certain mathematical properties that needs to be reserved. So in the future, if creators would have to create their own tools, this is how the interface should look like, right? Not coding, not programming. Maybe they are part of it, but it should be something, a tool that is visual, that has varying levels of abstraction and relationship between different representations. Now, there's this great paper from Yaraju a while back, talks about the history of programming languages. There were many visions of programming languages. In the early days of programming languages, there are different variations. Some programming languages were more pictorial, and some of them were more textual. The reason we see a dominant programming language like today is because, cultural and political reasons. At that time, IBM keyboard was a dominant industry, and it was always easy to use a programming language that can be translated with a keyboard, right? That's why that specific vision won. But that doesn't mean that that programming language and representation is the best one. But that was the most convenient one. So I believe that, so that says that programming languages and notation is all programming language is also a type of notation, but it's on the one end of the spectrum. So like any other notation, programming language is also a result of cultural tools, cultural artifacts. So imagine we have, I believe that, programming language will evolve and they will have more heterogeneous representations. In a dynamic environment, we'll have this, not only have this static visual abstractions, but as we draw these, atomic particles, we will see the corresponding mathematical representations. We can see how they relate to each other. We can see what will happen if I change the equation. We can see why that equation is divergence free. We can do all these interactive simulations to build and customize our own tool. Okay, so let's wrap it up. Let's wrap it up with a fictional story, right? Imagine a Feynman diagram. Feynman diagram is just a bit of background. It's a very famous theoretical physics tool invented in the 80s, actually 60s or 70s. And it changed theoretical physics because it showed how you can do very complex mathematics just by drawing pictures. It's actually a pictorial representation. So it changed the way how theoretical physics do computation as well as think. Now, if there's a parallel universe where Feynman diagram come up with this new tool, which is also a new tool, cognitive tool, but he will not do vibe coding, he will do vibe sketching. How would that look like? Feynman will do it, think spatially. Originally his pictures were very static, but now, because it's a computational medium, it will, from the ground up, it will be interactive simulations with different states and parameters, different particles color-coded. And then, there will be agents that will help him to validate different ideas, come up with the right abstractions, help him to come up with the right visualization schema, and when two particles interact with each other, visualize all the possible variations. And he will also have evaluation agents and partners that will help him to really validate that the diagrams he develop are really compatible with all the mathematical representations and everything they know about theoretical physics. Right. So this is how a vibe sketching process would look like with visual and computational medium. And once he has this Feynman diagram, he will share it with his peers, and maybe the peers will interact them in different ways. Some will interact them, while they're walking with speeches, and some of them will, a PhD student will interact them in AR and VR, gestural interactions. It's adaptive to the context of users' needs and domain, and maybe a postdoc will just adapt the diagram or tool to a new domain and tailor to its new needs. So So I think this is how broadly I believe that creators will think like. As I said, notational thinking is not just visual thinking, it is a way of thinking with levels of abstractions, with different representations and correspondence. So when I see, I'm a visual person, as you can see, and I kind of, when I see this very powerful text-based interaction with models, I can see some parallels between, what happened in 70s and 80s. When command line interfaces came, people thought computers are a tool for computation. And when Alan Kay said, computers is a powerful tool for tinkering, communication, it was a radically different perspective at that time. We take these things as granted now. And when even Sutherland and others developed, direct manipulation interface, the new metaphors like, we should be able to interact with digital informations with mouse and cursors and these icons. Those were also new metaphors at that point. So I think our new programming in environments and direct manipulation interfaces need to evolve in these new technological revolutions, and we will have to come up with new interaction techniques, new metaphors to facilitate powerful ways of thinking, and that will require an interdisciplinary approach, drawing principles from cognition, HCI, and other domains. Thank you so much.
So I'm very excited to introduce Barbara Tversky. Barbara is a professor emerita of psychology at Stanford University and a professor of psychology and education at Teachers College, Columbia University. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a past president of the Association for Psychological Science, and the author of Mind in Motion, How Action Shapes Thought. Across more than 200 papers, she has reshaped how we understand memory, spatial cognition, event perception, and closest to this room, how we think with sketches, diagrams, and gestures. And much of what we mean by lines and minds traces back to her work. So it's a big honor to have her here with us. Please welcome Barbara Tversky.
Thank you so much for that kind. It must have been an introduction for somebody else. Am I not on?
It takes a moment to mirror.
It's not.
Do you need mirror or like present?
I put it in present mode. Excellent. Okay. And I'm about to commit the errors I tell all my students not to commit, and that's to tell you too much and talk too fast. Okay. All creatures must move and act in space to survive. We spend our lives living and acting in space. Even plants need to lean toward the sun and away from the wind. Even bacteria need to move to survive. So when motion ceases, life ends. The elemental action in space is to approach the nutritious or avoid the noxious, and that act is replete with emotion. So as I claim recklessly, all thought begins with spatial thought. It's not the entire edifice, but the foundation. And what I mean by action, I mean acting in space with the things in it. So space is special, it's supramodal. We know about space not just from vision, but from all our senses. Sound, wind, smell, our own proprioceptive feedback. It's essential for survival. It's the basis for other knowledge. It's not, our sense of space is not like geometry or physical measurement. There are systematic distortions from our perception and action. It's another talk. But and I hate to say first, we need to put the world in our mind, and those are the various spaces we act in, the space of the body, the space around the body and reach of hand or eye, and this, especially the space of exploration, which we need to know from many different experiences. We can't see it all at once. We have to piece it together. So again, those representations are distorted by intertwined perception and action. And then we put our mind in space, in the world. We create many spaces. They become cognitive tools. They're also ways to make our life more pleasant. So among them are maps, sketches, social spaces like this one, urban spaces, and so on. So a lot of what I'm going to say is summarized by this, this image that was on a sneaker shop somewhere that I saw it, and the photograph is terrible, but it says, move your body, your mind will follow. So I couldn't think of a better way of summarizing what I've been doing. So as we move in space, we make lines in the world. And well-trodden paths tell us that they're safe, lots of people have gone there, and they're promising. They might lead to something nutritious. So, as Clay famously said, a line is a dot that went for a walk. So we end up walking, driving, and we create paths and places on the earth, networks on the face of the earth, and we keep doing it. We've pretty much carpeted the work, and that becomes inspiration for art, more Hockney. So if acting in space is the foundation of thought, we should see that everywhere, and we do. We see it in brain, language, graphics, gesture, and I'll go briefly through brain and language. They deserve much more, and a little bit more into graphics and gesture. And the main thing I'll be proposing is we use space and things in it to think, communicate, and create. So brain, and this is the work that won the Nobel Prize in 2012 for John O'Keefe and the Moshers. They found single cells in hippocampus that light up when a rodent is in a particular place. They weren't spatially arrayed, but they were spatially arrayed next door in grid cells, and the grid cells mapped those different locations in a semi-Euclidean, not really Euclidean pattern. And researchers since then have found that those single cells in hippocampus fire for places, events, people, and ideas in humans, and that the grid cells map spatial, temporal, social, and conceptual relations. So the same structures that in people that are used to represent places in spatial relations are also used by people to represent events in temporal relations, people in social relations, and ideas in conceptual relations. So that's all I'm going to say about brain. I could tell you also that space is represented in many parts of the brain. There's a lot of redundancy in the brain. Thank goodness. So it's reflected in language as well. So human beings have hands, which rodents have hands, but they aren't so useful. And even the non-human primates have hands, not so useful. Ours are especially useful. And we use the way we talk about hands and feet to talk about thinking. So our feet are like paths in thought. So one thought leads to another. Our thoughts follow a straight line sometimes. Often they go in circles, zigzag, wander. Our thoughts can go up, they can go down, and we can kick around thoughts. So there it becomes like feet. But feet are acting more specifically on thought, on individual thoughts, not on the train of thoughts. So we can raise ideas, we can toss them out, we can tear them up, we can pull them together, we can arrange them. So, and when we say those things, we often gesture concomitantly. So these are very vivid actions, and it's hard to talk about actions on thought without using the language of actions on objects. Try it. So thinking is a path that our feet take through our thoughts, and ideas are objects. I'm not the only one that has made these observations. So we also have figurative spaces. We talk about being out of depth. We talk about thinking out of the box. There's a new book saying we should think within the box. Constraints help thinking. Both are true. We talk about people at the top of the class, feeling up, falling into a depression. We talk about getting closer to people. We talk about people opening a field. We can go on and on. When your ear becomes attuned to this, you hear it everywhere. And again, they're accompanied by gestures. So I'm jumping now to graphics. First ancient, then modern. So I'll show you a bunch of images from caves and stones, rock art, it's often called, and they go way back. This is a recent discovery in Sulawesi, of a cave with amazing images. This is only one. Chauvet is known to people, has been known for a long time. This is in Utah. You can go visit it, not far away. It's 9 Mile Canyon. It's filled with petroglyphs like this. This inspired your bookmark. It's an event, and you see these people pointing to two suns in the sky. Why two suns? And this was 4,000 years ago in Kashmir, and an Indian astronomer found out that exactly then there was a supernova. So this was an extraordinary event, extraordinary enough that somebody took the effort. It probably took many days to carve it into a stone. So we've had animals, people and animals. This is a scene of a hunt. We've had another event. We also find, they find what they think of as tallies. I'm not so sure they're tallies or just decorative, but they go way back. And then we find maps. And maps are extraordinary. So this one is about this big. It's 2 inches by 1, a stone that was found in a cave in Spain, and it depicted the world outside. So it's not convincing, as convincing as we'd like of a map. This one it's a slab in Brittany, and the slab is 7.2 feet by 5 feet, and it is depicting an area that's 19 by 13 miles. This is before writing arrived in France. And in fact, you can find many examples of ancient maps that were before writing. So it was important to map things. And you can see it's very abstracted. There are a lot of lines and points. This is a cave in Italy. This is an area in Italy with these sorts of, it's a drawing of a petroglyph, and the valley, Berlino Valley, is filled with them. They're not so ancient. There was probably writing around, I'm not sure. But again, you can see there are paths and objects, places along the paths. South Sea Islander maps, the South Sea Islanders, again, I think before writing, carried in their boats on the open ocean 2,000 miles, and at least some of them got back. And the shells are islands. They're too far to be seen one from another. And the bamboo strips are the ocean currents. So they're like the highways, the paths along the ocean. Okay, so ancient graphics depict what is important because you have to go to great trouble to create them. So we saw people, animals, things. We saw events, stories. We saw things that might be tallies, primitive numbers, and we saw maps. And maps are the first real abstraction to be found amongst these ancient images. They're an amazing feat of the imagination. They aren't views like people, animals, events that you're looking at. You might be remembering them, I think, in a dark cave. You're making them from memory, not from seeing them. Maps transform frontal views. We experience the world straight on to overviews. Okay, so they need to make that mental transformation. They abstract and integrate many different views. If you're mapping something that's 20 miles on a slab 7 feet, you have to have explored it and integrated it and abstracted what's important. So they also shrink a large area that's not visible at once to a small area. So maps are extraordinary. That people can do them is extraordinary. Maps then become their networks of dots and lines, nodes and link, places and paths, and like the brain, they represent not just real space, but ideas and relations. They go way back. This is Aristotle's tree of knowledge. Nobody has found a tree from him, but the classification, the hierarchy of concepts subdividing into other concepts, taxonomy goes way back. The extraordinarily important in the Middle Ages. Trees were, and tree diagrams, people have written histories just on them. They're quite wonderful. So these are hierarchies, taxonomies of ideas, family trees. This is the internet in 1987. Okay, it gets bigger. So networks of transportation, computers, ideas, social networks. We had people put something on a page that depicts your social network, and people often put their families on top and their friends to the side. Phylogenetic trees, history of modern art, you can find this in MoMA. This is art. They take up a whole wall, bigger than the image here, and they're Mark Lombardi. People study them in their political economic. Steinberg. So I've been obsessed by lines, some more Steinberg, obsessed by lines. So they're the lines we draw with our hands. The lines the eye sees when there are none. So the eye is really after lines. It's different from the fingers. Fingers aren't after lines, which is why tactile maps are a problem, even for the blind, because our fingers are after texture, wave, temperature. So lines the eye, but eyes are after lines. Lines the eye see when there are none. Lines we make in the world. Lines our hands draw to make stories. Great book, especially if you have preschoolers. So lines connect, but they also make boundaries. And lines draw anything you like. Here's more Steinberg, and the line you see on the left, Steinberg drawing, and the line keeps changing meaning. And you can interpret it easily by the context. So gestures and graphics, or graphics and gestures, have more direct meaning than symbolic words. And again, a much longer topic I wish we could dwell on. And they're made of marks on a page or actions by your hands, gestures. And we also use the place in space and the spatial relations. I mean, watch my hands, to understand graphics and gestures. And the vocabulary bears great similarities. So you could think of a minimal diagram like a proposition. It's a link between 2 points. And the points again can represent places, events, people, ideas, things, whatever you like. And the lines are connections or relations or links among them. And so often in these networks you see, the links aren't labeled. And that's something that needs to be done. So we can think of having a kind of spatial semantics, and some of this we've actually tested. I won't be able to tell you all of the details. So place and space, we use proximity, we've drawn closer to each other. We use centrality. There was a story of an African ruler who had thought he wanted to be very modern, early 20th century. So he had his territory mapped. He discovered that the capital was not in the center of the country. And this disturbed him, so he had them move the capital on the map, not in the world, on the map. Okay? We've seen that happen, right? Our president did that once, at least once. Okay, direction in space has meaning. The vertical is everything that goes up is good. And that's partly probably because you have to fight gravity to go up. So you have to have strength, resources, good move, be powerful to go against gravity. Horizontal is neutral, though reading order has big effects on it. There's a cottage industry of papers on the effects of reading order. It's fascinating. So then we have our marks, and the marks can be things that represent things like icons, depictions, whatever. But there's also this other vocabulary of points and lines and arrows and boxes that have meaning, and they come from our experience in space. Again, we're making lines in space, and where we settle, we make areas or boxes. I think I'm gonna, these are just, so part of our semantics is bars contain and lines connect, and that changes of the meaning of the graph. So people assume discrete relations between bars, and they assume from lines that you have a continuous relation, but the two entities have different values on that relation. So we can change the meaning, the interpretations of the data by turning them from lines to bars. And more detail another time. We can also change meaning with arrows. And whether arrows are natural in the same way as lines is somewhat debatable. I mean, arrows do go in the direction that they fly. They also, arrows in erosion indicate the direction they're going. So there's some basis for understanding arrows. This was an early arrow. You can see this in the stone in Ephesus, and that foot is leading to the Bravo. Okay, and the size of the foot is the size your foot needed to be, so the saying goes, to get into the Bravo, excluding children. Okay, so we gave people these diagrams either with arrows or without arrows. Without arrow, and asked people for descriptions. Without arrows, people give us structural descriptions. They tell us where the parts are in relation to each other. If we add an arrow, they give us temporal, behavioral, causal descriptions. They tell us what happens from first to end. And we get the reverse with diagrams. If we give structural descriptions, we get diagrams without arrows. If we give behavioral or functional causal descriptions, we get lots of arrows. So they have a direct meaning. Okay, we use space to think about time. We talk about an event being before another. We talk about our troubles being behind us, we hope. We talk about approaching holidays, long time, times arrow. So all the ways we talk about space are used to talk about time. Again, this is the work of other people. And both of them we tend to chunk. We chunk space into places on lines, and we chunk time into events on lines. And then we use that, I'm getting into Scott's territory. One nice thing about comics is we can do both at the same time. So here, the sequence of boxes is telling you the time, but you've got the background, the space, the entire space it's happening in. You get it for free. Not just for free, it's beautiful. Okay? But we're boxing the time. You get a similar thing. This is Feynman. We had Feynman a minute ago. So here's Feynman talking with a graduate student. We see the territory they're walking in and see them. We can use these boxes in very interesting ways. So we've slanted them to show you the speed, okay? And we can break boxes. I mean, all these conventions are there to be broken. So this is Sammy sneezing. Choo! And when he sneezes, he breaks his frame. So there are hundreds of these, and I can show you some that John Bresman and I have collected over the years. So I'm going to jump now to gestures. This one is universal, okay? Pointing. Babies all over the world do it. They do it before they speak. They make their parents prisoners. My daughter used to be carried, she'd point, and I was supposed to take her from this place to that place to this place. Okay, pointing. We have this guy again. And we have these ladies. This is a courtesy of Susan Goldenmeadow, who's the queen of gesture. And we have very nice gestures, peaceful ones. Okay, so like depictions, unlike language, they connect directly to meaning. They help others understand and think. Hundreds of lovely papers on that. But what we've been studying is they help us think, and we've been doing it in the context of maps. So we have people reading these complicated descriptions, locating 4 or 8 landmarks in space. Don't read it, okay? You won't be tested. But our students were. Here's somebody reading one of those descriptions. So watch her hands. And notice that she is not watching her hands. Okay, she's making lines and points. She's making a map. Here's another one, and again I have bunches of these. It's not coming up. There. So again, she watches her hands a bit, but mostly she's watching the screen and making a model with her hands. We get the same thing when we ask people to understand complicated systems like car brakes or not police systems, car brakes. And we get the same thing when we ask people to remember the linear order of countries by their GNP, or events companies by what events they're sponsoring when, a table, and so they're reading the text and they're making a table, okay? Or they're reading the text and making a linear ordering. When they do that, they remember better, okay? So they're studying complicated descriptions. About 70% spontaneously make gesture maps for at least one of their descriptions, and when they do, they perform better. And if we take a new group, make them sit on their hands, they perform worse. And some of them say, I can't think without my hands. Okay, and again, we've replicated it with mechanical systems, linear orders, and matrices. So clear, uncluttered diagrams, perhaps you've seen this, help us perform. We want them very clear and very ordered, 1, 2, 3. But messy, ambiguous lines help us create. There's wiggle room to interpret and reinterpret and invent. So we studied architects who drawing a design. They're supposed to design a museum on a hillside. They love the project. Some experienced, some novices, and so they start drawing, and their drawings are sketch-like, and when they look at them again, they see new things. So, and this is a productive cycle. As they keep drawing, they keep seeing new things, and that inspires new drawings, things that they couldn't anticipate. I mean, the Picasso quote was lovely, that I can't know what I'm going to draw until I'm drawing it. So they talk about it as a conversation between the eye, the hand, and the mind. And more experienced architects make more discoveries and more conceptual ones. The novices make perceptual ones. And one strategy for creativity is reconfiguring parts. And the ambiguity allows you to reconfigure. Things aren't settled. So Andrea Kantrowitz, who wrote a beautiful book on this, I was on her committee. So she studied artists who are experienced drawers, and in both cases, they thought they could talk while they were drawing, or we thought they could. They couldn't. The talking interferes with the doing, and it's, as I say, a conversation between the eye, the hand, and the mind. And if you start explaining it, you can't do it any longer. So artists say the ideas emerge from the page. So these are some of the things that Andrea collected. Drawing is creating something from nothing. Drawing enters other worlds. You create a world and then you play with it. It gets a life of its own. It turns into other drawings, drives itself. It's exploration, finding things, discovery. It focuses attention, engages. It's calm. It's fun, playful, safe. There are many more. Find Andrea's book. So thinking with sketches, gesture, other things, is intelligent and skilled. It's invisible. You can't put it in words, you can't see it in the brain. It's interactive, you're constantly interacting with what you're seeing and changing things. It's context bound, it's not easily codable, we don't have the words, we can't code whatever's happening in the brain, and it's everywhere. It's unique. Every time you look at a painting, you get new ideas. Every time you hear music, you hear new things. So all of this, in my mind, is a challenge for Gen AI. You can't have a corpus that's big enough to generate stuff. So it's, again, an audacious claim, but I think it's a challenge. And the fact that it leaves some magic to us, either as creators or as consumers, or enjoyers of it, is maybe okay. Okay, I'm going to end soon with a concept that's an ugly word. Latinate words are ugly. Abstraction. It's a contraction of space, action, and abstraction. And the tenet is that actions in space create abstractions. So actions on thought, on objects, become gestures that act on thought. And so the actions get truncated. I throw out ideas, I pull them together. There's nothing here to pull together. It's just a gesture on an invisible object, a thought. And the abstractions we create become visualizations. I'll give you some examples in a minute. So this is the world that nature gives us. You can still find it in a few places, more. Save the concrete. This is the world that we design. So we've designed the world. We use themes, all things with different categories of objects get used in different rooms of the house. So everything with eating is in the kitchen, although by now we eat everywhere. But everything for getting clean is in the bathroom, and so forth. So we organize by themes, we organize by categories, hierarchies, and orders. All of this you see in the world. The big bowls are in one stack, and the small ones are in another, and the bowls are in a different stack from the plates. So we have categories, hierarchies, and orders. In our table settings, we have one-to-one correspondences, repetitions, cycles, and embeddings, sounding like a computer program. Same in our buildings, repetitions, symmetries, embeddings, one-to-one correspondences in 3D. Then we take all these structures that we've built and turn them into visualization. So I'm thinking to grow up in this environment, not the caves that our ancestors grew up in. Look how much the environment is teaching us, right? When we wander around, we're learning, children learn so much just from what, I mean, you learn from the caves too. You learn which plants are poisonous and which ones are edible and so forth. So there's a whole set of things you learn there, but there's a kind of a set of abstractions that you learn when you're living in a designed world. So then we turn those boxes on the skyscrapers into timetables, into probably one of the best visualizations ever. We turn them into jokes, how long it took me to draw and color each of these bars. We turn them into insightful cartoons. I could give 14 talks just on Steinberg. He's just brilliant. So, and in addition, we design our surroundings. Some of you came by airplane. If you look at in the airport from above, the airport is a diagram. It tells where different kinds of cars and planes and people can go. So it allows motion in space, and it restricts motion in space. And we are living in a diagram. Here it is. Right? We're living in a diagram. So I end with a gesture, and thank you.
Next, we'll have a brief remarks by Scott McCloud. So, for those of you who don't know Scott is a cartoonist and comics theorist, and the author of Understanding Comics, the Invisible Art, which has been translated into 16 languages and remains a standard reference on visual communication well beyond the field of comics. In 2021, he received the Will Eisner Awards Hall of Fame. And he is also the author of Reinventing Comics, Making Comics, and the graphic novel The Sculpture and the series Zod. His work on how images convey meaning has shaped how many of us in this room think about drawing, abstraction, and visual storytelling. And it is really a big privilege to have you here. So please welcome Scott McCloud.
Mostly, I'm here to speak with Barbara, and mostly you're going to be looking at a conversation between the two of us, moderated by Judy. But I just wanted to give you 4 minutes because I need a few pictures to just give you an orientation so you'll understand where I'm coming from as we enter into that conversation. So I've been telling stories in comics for a long time, but I'm mostly known for this nonfiction book, which you just mentioned, Understanding Comics, which I made back in 1993, where I walk around describing all these things like how we interpret the space between panels, how we can map images in space, how space equals time, how we can trigger emotions and sensations in space. So when Barbara Tversky's book, Mind in Motion, came out, I was, it was just like catnip for somebody like me. Absolutely loved it. But I also desperately needed that book because when it came out, I was knee-deep in a years-long project where I was studying visual communication, especially bad visual communication. Like this infographic that was in a Tennessee hotel room that I found long ago. And I was obsessed with this thing. I couldn't stop looking at it. I was like, oh no, my hotel is on fire, but I cannot read this language. Fortunately, there is this helpful picture to explain how to, wait, what? So my wife and I we kept looking at this, and I decided to post it on Twitter. This is long before Musk took over, and my followers offered various interpretations. In case of fire, run downstairs into the ski lift. In case of 2 fires, ride the elevator heading to the larger fire. In case of a Goliath attack, hide in a companion cube and get upvoted to safety. Use chopsticks to remove cooked children from hot oven. So I'm thinking, okay, how do we go about fixing this sort of thing? What are the rules? What are the do's and don'ts? And I was like, hey, maybe I could do a kind of elements of style for visual communications. That'd be fun, wouldn't it? And best of all, that was a nice short book, so it wouldn't take me a long time. So I thought. But then I realized how many of these things there were. They were everywhere. That wasn't even the only terrible fire safety diagram. There's this one. You've all seen this one, right? There's the no matter what you do, you're on fire variation. And then there's all the maps and the road signs and the safety cards and the ads and the emojis and the data visualizations and the educational animation and the nonfiction comics, like the kind of things I do, and even the form of communication that you're looking at right now, visual presentations, right? But it matters. Bad visual design can kill people. I mean, this is a consequential subject, right? This is an important subject. So I wanted to do it right, but the book kept growing. But as I was trying to compile all of these do's and don'ts, these rules, I realized that I couldn't really understand the structure of these rules before I understood the various theories of visual perception from which they grew. And the more I studied visual perception, I realized I couldn't really understand that until I understood the biology of vision. And the more I studied the biology of vision, the more I realized that I couldn't understand it until I understood the evolution of vision. And that's where my head was at when Barbara's book came out. And that is where I first learned about that smoking gun in the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex with those very place cells and grid cells. Shout out to all you Settlers of Catan players out there. With those place cells and grid cells that our ancestors used to get from the cave to the watering hole to the hunting grounds, and that we used to get from our desks to the meeting room to the bathroom, were being repurposed along with other parts of the brain to help us to grapple with invisible, intangible, abstract concepts. And it's the reason why, just as exactly as Barbara was describing it to you, it's the reason why an office worker might believe that they have somebody working underneath them, whereas while they're working underneath someone else, even though they're all sitting side by side. It's the reason why a distant relative might be living next door while your closest friend lives 1,000 miles away. It's how we cross paths, how time moves forward, how anxiety can be on the rise. Our language is overflowing with spatial metaphors. Our grasp of the abstract world, with its intangible concepts like time, logic, and energy, is built on the same mental framework that supports us in the physical world. Every new concept we come across gets spatialized so we can better wrap our heads around it as we pass through life. And if you don't believe me, here are all the spatial metaphors in that paragraph. So these are the tools that I use every day. They've really informed my work, in large part thanks to Barbara Tversky's book. And they are aiding me in the art of visual explanation, which I think we desperately need in this time when a lack of understanding of countless extremely important subjects is, not to overstate it, but it's an existential threat, I think. So I do consider visual explanation very important, and I'm hoping that I can figure out how to use these spatial metaphors to contend with subjects which, in many ways, we did not evolve to understand. So that'll be one of the topics that I hope will come up in our conversation. That's it. I think that was 4.5 minutes. So.
Thank you so much.
To begin to digest and synthesize some of the themes that have come up throughout the afternoon, here's just a subset of some of the themes that I hope that we'll also explore, in addition to coming back to the stakes of visual communication. We'll definitely pick up on that thread. We heard from Aaron Hertzmann about visual processing limitations as a way of thinking about those as a catalyst for abstraction and creativity. From Rubaiat about the value and the power of having access to flexible abstractions, personal abstractions, embodied personal tools that creators define. And we just heard about spatial abstractions enacted in action with our bodies, and the ways in which spatial metaphors can be deployed so well in the world, as well as how they can be quite misused, from Scott's remarks. I want to begin by recognizing that the two of you in your own work take the long view, I would say, the long view in thinking about visual and spatial modes of thinking and expression. We're also seated here in this room in LA at the start of SIGGRAPH, home of where we really are thinking about the future of tooling for visual modes of expression and creation. And what's really exciting is that we're here at this meeting point between the most enduring tools as well as the ones that are just coming down the pike. I want to share another example of a tree, actually, one that didn't come up yet, because in my own work, I also find myself obsessed by lines, obsessed by trees as well, and hierarchies, and all the different ways that we create diagrams to make sense of the world. One of my favorite examples is this diagram. 22 years before Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, he scribbled this into a notebook. He was working out his ideas about natural selection, and really, which led to the ideas that transformed our conception of the place of humans within the animal kingdom, and biology itself, how we thought about life. And what I want to invite the two of you, perhaps, to think a little bit about, in much the same way Darwin was using the page of this notebook and his pen as a cognitive tool to really make a discovery about the world. What is a time in your own practice and scholarship that you felt that you weren't sure what you were about to discover, but as soon as you began to set marks to a page or move your body, you had some flash of insight in your own work?
You can go first.
Oh, okay, sure. Well,
I'm not sure I ever had his.
Well, it's funny because sometimes you find that like little crystalline piece of an idea that David Lynch talks about this when making movies, that then attaches itself to something and then attaches itself to something else. Sometimes, though, every once in a while, you just stumble into this hole in the universe where something ought to be. And you have to take that cognitive leap where you just spitball it, you imagine something that might fill that hole. I ran into that when I started doing Understanding Comics, a book that I did very quickly, there were places where it's just, there's something missing here. And I really, I was just hoping that I could just make up something sitting on the can and, you know, like just thinking about it, daydreaming about it, and every once in a while that would actually work. But you had to have that sense of that hole in the universe. You know, like almost anything really worth making is something that, for the lack of it, there's something missing in the world, you know? And it's always a good feeling when you feel like you're onto that. But you may, just like Picasso, that notion of the vague idea that it's only through the action of making it that you can actually discover what it is. You have to follow that instinct sometimes. And it's not, okay, this may sound off topic, but I swear it's not. I often think about what I think was sort of the lie of Mr. Spock, which is this notion that logic and love were ever incompatible. And it's that generative, irrational, aesthetic impulse is not in any way the opposite of logic. It's no more than land and sea are opposites. There just happens to be a line between them. But I think that you're going down that aesthetic road in the knowledge that at some point you will make something or bump into something that will require your rational self to make sense of it. And yeah, I guess that's a very, very fuzzy answer, half an answer. But it's a really good question, which is why I'm giving such a jumbled answer.
Yeah, the hole in the universe, feeling that.
This is really from my talk. So I've obviously been thinking about maps forever. And that idea that, and I've talked about cave drawings, rock art, in many occasions they completely fascinate me. I must be the only parent that on school vacations took my kids to caves in France and Mexico and archaeological sites everywhere instead of going to resorts, okay? So those drawings fascinate me, and again I've been thinking about maps and thinking that what people depicted must be the important things in their lives, because those depictions are so onerous. You go into a cave, there are snakes there, and bats, and it stinks, and you have to carry torches, and have paint that will stay on the walls. I mean, it took enormous artistry and courage to do that. So it had to be important. And again, thinking about maps, and then finally coming to what seems obvious now is maps are entirely different from other images. And why are they so important? And then the many metaphorical uses of maps for any kind of partonomy or taxonomy. So I think that was, from years of thinking about maps and where they are in the brain and how they function in communicating or in understanding the world, and then finally seeing what's really, how did people draw them, right? How did people, it's qualitatively different from drawing anything else. So, I mean, that's a small insight that hit me a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. Can we keep pulling on that thread? Maps were this massive insight that humans had some few thousand years ago, right? Being able to stitch together all those different views into one overhead view that no one had ever seen before. I'm curious, I'm going to zoom out for a second. There's so many different modalities of visual expression and communication that we've covered this afternoon just in this workshop, that of course also featured throughout the week at SIGGRAPH. Do you think that there are some ideas that are better expressed in one of these formats than another? Say a map, a cartoon, an animation, a natural video?
I can offer you one concrete example of something that's related. you know, one of the great leaps that maps represent is that notion of dimensionality reduction, right? That, you know, as I think you noted, the fact that we're, you know, we could represent, like our GPS could represent, you know, longitude, latitude, and elevation. It's capable of that, and sometimes you can, you know, click the little box that nobody ever clicks to see the you know, the topography and whatnot. We don't usually do that because that is, you know, to flatten the world like that is useful for most navigational purposes. But I was at a conference at Berkeley, I think it was, and there was somebody who was doing surveys of these wells in some remote part of the world, where certain of the wells were bringing up water that was poisonous, and there didn't seem to be any pattern. You know, like with John Snow and cholera in London, there was a pattern. You know, you could see that there was some proximity there, but there was no apparent pattern until you brought back the y-axis, until you brought back elevation, and you saw which wells were deeper than other wells, and that's when you understood that it came from groundwater contamination from a local polluter. And so, like, it's the great intuition of maps, and all maps are lies. That's like rule number one, all maps are lies, right?
All models are wrong.
All models are wrong, but some are more useful than others, yeah. Where was I going with this? Oh, damn.
Starting with the wells.
All maps are...
They're vertical.
The vertical dimension.
Right, but the thing is we came to the point where we understood, first of all, it is our own limitations that demand that we have to reduce the world. We have to. We can't. Nobody can represent the world in full. But like we learn to reduce as necessary, and a lot of visualization is just about knowing what truly is necessary. I don't know. This is you know, a bit fuzzy. Keep going.
Yes. Burn my few.
And the fact, so when architects design, and this goes back to Vitruvius, they design in the plane or the elevation. So thinking three-dimensionally is hard for people. It's even hard for people with good vision. You have to train yourself. Somebody did a study ages ago showing that one kind of 3D visualization doesn't transfer to another. You have to relearn it. But there's also the behavior is different. So if you're doing a plan of a building, you're thinking about how people move through the building. If you're doing an elevation, you're thinking about the appearance of the building, or how people confront it from or where the pipes and the electricity and so forth are going. So the vertical, the two views have different functionality, which maybe is useful because we're very bad at 3D.
Right, and we're like from the beginning, what are we doing with stereopsis? When we're trying to create a 3D model from our two eyes simultaneously, we're already living in flatland, right? You know, the whole thing is landing in the visual cortex, and we're hacking through it. It's this big kludgy hack that we're using to take what is, after all, what lands on our retina is flat, right? It's not 3D. We're trying to infer 3D. So yeah, it's already a big hot mess that we have to improvise in order to understand it. And it's important to say that we don't just understand 3D information we think of this as our primary mode, but we have so many other ways of interpreting the 3D world. Things like motion parallax. This is one of the reasons that 3D movies always underwhelm. It's because we get so much 3D information just from a moving camera, just from seeing the world passing by.
This reminds me of the segment on gesture, Barbara, in your talk, where those participants who were following along those navigation instructions couldn't help but make hand movements in order to keep track of the locations in different parts of the world. And it makes me wonder, why are we so tethered to the page, right? And flat screens and displays, when in fact we could be moving our body. Why are our computers not receiving, 3D input or embodied input quite the way that they could be?
So, I mean, people use 3D for visualizations early on. And they have these flyover visualizations. You can put anything anywhere. And, people would throw tomatoes at me when I said 3D is really hard for people. And I try to give them some evidence and they'd say, oh, that's just for that. It's not. But they learn through experience of these flyby visualizations that people just can't do it. They can. And it is a bit of a mystery. We navigate a 3D world, but imagining it is, for many people, extremely difficult.
Yeah.
Part of it is the retina is flat, but I think it goes cognitive, it must go deeper.
Yeah. I do think, though, there are some things that are difficult to represent in flatland. In fact, when I was first learning about the anatomy of the eye itself, those flat diagrams that I kept coming up with were always inadequate. And I had to look at 1,000 of them to begin to construct my own internal 3D model. Or you'll notice I had the rotating, when I wanted to show you where the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex is, I had to have the rotating model, because if I just showed you a flat, side view of the brain, it would really mean anything to anyone. Because those structures, they're what we call non-canonical forms. They're not, we don't really have a primitive in our heads to construct the whole limbic system or whatever. It's too complex, it's too weird. We can't make sense of it. But when it's rotating like that, then you sort of you're like a rock climber who eventually figures out where all the various protrusions are. But that's a special case, I think, where it's difficult, like if somebody's learning brain anatomy, they have to go in and start reaching in and pulling things out and seeing where all the wrinkles are and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think there are some important uses for it. Also, stereopsis in particular, we misunderstand stereopsis, the sort of thing they're trying to perfect with virtual reality. It's not a spectator sport. Your two eyes are not a lean back experience, it's a lean forward experience. It's like reaching out to catch the fly with chopsticks. It's manipulation. That's why we have stereopsis. It's running forward to catch our prey, is why we have two eyes in the front of our heads.
Or a tennis ball.
Yeah.
And I'm even thinking, you're gesturing so much as you speak about it. And sculpture, I'm thinking it's really through manipulation that we get the third dimension.
Yeah.
It's not just vision. And of course we can upset vision, all those old experiments with moving the visual field, and you couldn't function until you learn, but the learning had to happen with the action and the perception jointly.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be, it would be, someone here might know, it's beyond my knowledge of perception, but I wouldn't be surprised if you need the manipulation as we navigate a 3D world, not bumping into things. I mean, that we need that interaction with our own actions to get the real understanding of 3D.
Yeah, and you mentioned things like proprioception, which are, they don't belong to any of these categories that we've spoken of so far, but our awareness of where our limbs are at all times. It's thoroughly non-visual.
Right.
It's just there, you just know.
Maybe picking up another thread related to action, interaction, and motion. Both of you have thought for a long time about events, event segmentation, about what is shown in panels, what happens in between, right, in the mind of the reader. And in a callback, actually, to some ideas, Rubaiat, that you explored in your talk earlier, there's a tension, I think, a productive tension, but a tension nevertheless between personalization and every individual finding their own distinctive notational system or language for expressing and exploring ideas, and more broadly shared conventions or universal or they're being, or somehow arriving at systems that obey cognitive universals. And I'm curious how each of you thinks about the nature of the kind of variation that we do see. For example, variation that you've documented, Scott, in your own work when it comes to Japanese and American comics, in thinking about the relation between the content, what's depicted in panels, and what kind of work the reader is expected to do between panels. And when there is that divergence, where does that come from? And what role does it serve, given the kind of what would seem like pretty widely shared cognitive constraints that Barbara, you and Jeff Sachs and others have studied when it comes to event segmentation, how much agreement there is between observers who really can tell when one action ends and another action begins. How do you think about where disagreement comes from? Disagreement when it comes to the ways that people carve up events in time differently, say in comics or in other contexts.
So, I mean, we have one simple finding in carving up events, and that's how familiar they are. And when things get very familiar, you can say, make a bed. And when you don't know how to do it, you have to go down to a smaller scale, and eventually your knowledge becomes more and more abstract. But I think Scott, in understanding comments, one of the sections that I most found insightful was, how do you box it?
Yeah.
Do you make one big box for somebody thinking, or do you make many boxes for that same person thinking without changing the pose? And we talked about that in class. I used your book as a textbook for visual explanations, and we always talked about how you convey an extended time or chop it up and what that does.
Right.
It gets into music too, rhythm.
Well, it's very much like music, actually. And what you're describing there is like there are many different modes of the ways in which we manipulate time. And the first one that you were, I think, sort of referring to is that first decision we make, which is choice of moment, right? Which moments do I include, which moments do I take out? And how that's very much related. And you were the first one to actually point this out to me when I was watching one of your videos, that this is a form of event perception, right? When a cartoonist decides to tell something in 3 panels or 5 panels or 10 panels, we're tremendously flexible in that way. If I asked you, like, how did your morning go? You could give me the 2-panel version. You could give me the 10-panel version. And it's a form of event perception, but also a form of event chunking that you're actually pretty good at. Just natural. All of us are naturally good at that. And it's infinitely variable in comics. You could have a person bringing a spoon up to their mouth, having some soup, and you could do that in 10,000 panels. Or you could do the entire history of the universe in 2, right? I'll show you. Here, wait. There we go. There we go. There we go. There we go. Big Bang, heat death, right?
Just when Woody Allen went to a speed reading class, and their final was War and Peace. And he said, well, what was the upshot? And he said, it's about war and peace.
I had an editor. I had an editor who proposed that you could reduce Moby Dick to 3 words. Call me fish meal. 4 if you.
But I interrupt. The other thing that this isn't so much events, but close-ups versus distant.
Yeah.
And there, the parallels to language are strong. What do you do in great detail, and what do you say 4 years later?
Right, and it's also, there's a syntax to it, and a syntax of what changes and what doesn't change.
Right.
You know, that's one of the quotes that you mentioned. I forgot the exact wording, but it implied that, like, without some difference, without some change, without movement, nothing exists. Well, that's almost literally true in the retina, in the sense that there was that one experiment where they had I've forgotten if it was on a contact lens or something, but they had placed a dot upon the eye by way of some sort of sheath or whatever, but the result was that dot did not move on the retina, regardless of which way you looked. The dot was always in the same place on the retina. After I think it was, what, a second or two, the dot disappears. Because if it's not moving, it's just the retina is not interested. It ceases to exist. And every once in a while you have somebody whose ocular muscles are malfunctioning or something like that. They can't move their eye. Well, they have to move their head like a bird in order to see anything at all. Because unless it's refreshed, it's just not there. So motion, like visually, motion is life. The motion is the world. Without motion, there is no world.
And then, going back to art, that's what makes Roscoe's so interesting to look at, because your receptors stop acting, the color receptors, so it keeps changing on you because the receptors stop responding and then other receptors respond, and if you move your eyes, you'll get, again, things will come back. But it's part of why his paintings are so mesmerizing. So, and it brings up a question that I've talked about with other people in perception, is how much of human perception was first realized in art before the psychologists? So pointillism, Seurat, and the colors of the dots that he arranged and the shimmering that it induced. Again, you need motion because your receptors habituate. I mean, he was discovering things about vision and perception long before vision researchers knew that. Just Bridget Riley, she's not so familiar in this country, but very familiar in Vasarely. They both discovered a great deal about vision from playing that people in perception only understood later.
Right, because I think maybe the reason for that is because when it's created in art, you have an experience, and the experience is undeniable, right? It's just, I have experienced a thing, I'm going to see if I can make that happen again. And of course you're discovering some of the fundamentals of that cognitive experience. Or I think of Margaret Livingstone's ideas about equiluminant colors and how Monet managed to get certain effects in his paintings just because there were colors that were the same luminosity but different hues, and because the parietal, our sense of space temporal sphere, but because our sense of space is colorblind, it just doesn't know what to do with it, so things tend to squirm. Have you ever seen those, like two bright colors next to each other, that they're the same brightness, and so they squirm because part of our visual system is colorblind.
And speaking of Monets and water lilies, I see different colors with my two eyes, radically different. You can try it. Most people don't realize that. And I think lots of people actually see different colors with the two eyes. So when I look at Monet, with one eye and the other, completely different paintings. Because he's only using color. He isn't using the black-white to give outlines. So it's only color, hue, and the paintings are different. So have you had that experience? Yeah. So, and you see colors differently with each eye? Okay, but I think many people do, and it's a fun thing. I also have a great deal of astigmatism in one and not the other. So the Bridget Rileys look different like this. With the glasses and without. So I get, because of these defects, I get visual experiences that no one else does. But back to the artist, I think, and the artist discovering the shimmering colors and so forth, they're exploring in a nonverbal way.
Yes.
And they're saying, what are the limits of this phenomenon and how can I control it? And they're learning through the trial and error, give and take, And again, it isn't verbal. And again, that kind of thinking and discovery, I think, for AI is an issue. I'm raising this to be provocative. I'd love to hear what other people think, but I do think that kind of intelligence is going to be hard for Gen AI to capture.
And I just have to say that there was that moment where language does sometimes disrupt those sensations. There's that famous quote by Paul Valery, I think it was, to see is to forget the name of that which you see, yeah. And I think that's really true.
Well, and Aaron talked about artists saying you have to draw, that people draw what they know, not what they see. And it gets complicated on that because I think you also pointed out that sometimes you want to draw things that you wouldn't see. And of course that was Picasso's brilliance. He was drawing things that couldn't be seen and gave you a new way of understanding. So it gets complicated, I think, on that.
These examples are wonderful. These different discoveries made by different artists in their own practice. Something I also loved in some of our earlier conversations preparing for this event was that other artists and thinkers that you've really learned a lot from over the years, for the room, you mentioned some of them, some of whom may not be as well known as Picasso or Rothko. Are there any artists or thinkers who you feel that more people should be familiar with than are? You really want people to go and find their work?
Well, I did just now, I mentioned Margaret Livingstone, her book, Vision and Art, is very interesting. She's out of Harvard?
Yeah, the med school.
Arnheim is a lot of fun. He's just endlessly entertaining. One of my favorite Arnheim quotes is, we've often, you may have seen a cloud that looks like a camel, but you've never seen a camel that looks like a cloud. But a lot of he came after the Gestalt psychologists, but he just had a real instinct for those things, and I think his writings were a lot of fun. I also mentioned Edward Tufte, who's a big fan of that quote by Paul Valery. He writes about data visualizations and just the visualization of information. Highly recommend Tufte's work. He's seen as a bit cranky and grumpy, but actually he's very sweet, and he just really loves beautiful visualizations. Although he does get cranky about PowerPoint. And rightfully so.
I think he did a great deal to draw visualizations into the public.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been so, our field, my field, has been so reliant on language, and this misinformation that thinking is in language.
Yeah.
And to that, I always say, where did the words come from?
Mm-hmm.
They just pop into your head. Right? We don't know the thinking that goes behind selecting the words unless you're speaking a language you don't know very well and you're searching for words. On the whole, we're completely unaware of that. The thinking is behind it. So I think Tufte, you, other people have brought it in attention to the importance of the visual world and to how much we need to understand it and how much communication happens.
Learn from the words that people say and spew into the internet.
I use basketball as an example of a challenge because of how much field vision you need and how you need to communicate to your own team and miscommunicate to the other team, and you're doing that faster than words could possibly come. I mean, that level, of course, it's highly practiced, but I think on a smaller level, you just look at human interactions, you can sense very quickly if someone is disapproving or approving or interested, not interested, paying attention. Now, we're picking up those cues very, very quickly.
If we had to rely on language alone, we couldn't function. We have to be deriving so much. That's why another interesting thinker, Donald Norman, picked up on this idea of signifiers and affordances from J.J. Gibson. It doesn't matter. People with some interesting ideas look them up. But Norman famously pointed out that there are these doors that have these handles. Everyone sees the handle and naturally wants to pull it, and sometimes the doors are meant to be pushed. Well, it will always say, almost always, it will say push right on the door. But before we even think to read something, we just act, like we can't stop to read every sign out there. You expect to be able to walk out on the floor and walk down the stairs and walk out the main entrance without having to stop and read anything. Why should you have to stop and do anything? So it has to visually communicate first. And that's your mode of communication, your mode of wayfinding that comes from the natural world, from simply instantly, through your peripheral vision, just a quick look, and you know how things will behave. And when they don't behave the way their appearance implies, that's a failure of design. That's not your failure to try to pull the door that should be pushed. That's a failure of the design of the door itself. Its shape alone should show you that. But always look back to nature. When you're speaking of those spatial metaphors, it's because they come from nature, like the Lakoff and Johnson, and when they're talking about metaphors, they talk about the up is more, down is less, and you can see why, right? Pile of rocks, big pile of rocks, high. But so many of those spatial metaphors just come from the natural world. And it's the reason why when you started, you mentioned this idea about why taking the long view. It's because so many of the fundamentals, as technology is changing every single day, so many of the fundamentals are based on things that are millions of years old. And we're not going to change. The structure of our brains technology may be different in a century, but not these things. We're going to have the same equipment up here, so we have to understand how they work.
All right, let me hand you each a even taller soapbox. I want to come back to that thread about stakes, the stakes of effective visual communication, right? In 2026, they're really, really important challenges that we collectively are facing. I think we all would love to hear more about how you're thinking about what the messages are that are really important to get across.
Sure.
But one more thing on doors and the floor.
I'll get to that, I promise.
I don't know what the ecological validity of buttons are, but you can take an infant and give them a cell phone, and if there's a small circle the size of that kid will press it.
It's very true. Yes.
Yeah, I mean I guess it's a hole. They'll stick their finger. A hole is an invitation.
Yeah. What does it do?
Yeah. Well, or you want to stick it, which is why outlets get covered when babies begin to fall, because they're going to stick their finger into that hole. So where are the holes sticking?
Well, we've survived as a species so far, so apparently the sticking fingers in holes doesn't necessarily wipe us out. But
Judy asked a bigger question.
No,
yeah, well, I
think those are all important.
Well, what Judy's question actually does relate to the things that will wipe us out. Our cognitive limitations in dealing with any number of issues, right? Thinking of limitations of scale. This is something when I spoke to the New York Times graphics department, they had just pretty much given up on ever communicating the difference, let's say, between 1,000 and 1,000,000 and 1,000,000,000 and 1,000,000,000,000. Most of us in this room, we know intellectually the difference, but unless we're looking right at it, we're going to forget. We're going to forget. It's like pile, big pile, big pile. That's about as much as our brains can handle. But if you're confronted with it, if I showed you here, this is about, I don't even know how to erase. I don't use this program, but yeah. Oh yeah. Give me a new page. New page. Oh, fantastic. Oh, yeah. There we go. Okay, so approximately, this is 1 billion. And this is 1 million, just about. Okay, approximately. Million, billion. Now, if you weren't looking at this, okay, you would default to thinking small pile, big pile, and ditto for trillions. Think of the ways in which people can demagogue those numbers, in which they can get you outraged about, like, foreign aid is like $27 million, but oh, this battleship's only going to cost, it's $8 billion, and this will only raise the deficit by $500 billion. You have no way. But imagine if you were able to confront that while there were budget deficits going on, budget arguments going on. Meanwhile, big numbers, long time spans. If you tell somebody that within 50 years the Earth's temperature could raise by 2 degrees centigrade and this would cause chaos or whatever, they're like, well, I could be dead in 50 years. The difference between for us as animals, the difference between 50 years and a billion years is nothing, because we can only think in that existential window, right? Or in terms of scale, the universe. I'm sure most of you have seen things like Powers of 10. That's an attempt to try to daisy chain comparisons we can understand in order to understand scales that we can. But the problem is, when you're talking about the prospect of nuclear war, or of ecological disasters, all of these things, they run right up against the limitations of our brains to understand these things that we simply, there was no evolutionary utility to understanding any of this stuff, but visual communication is actually capable of grabbing onto it if we leverage those spatial metaphors. If we use those spatial metaphors to confront people with these things, to use them for analogies, they're much more robust than those sort of whimsical comparisons we come up with. And that's why I always try to come up with metaphors that are based on space, because metaphors that are based on space, they're interoperable, and they play nice with each other, and they actually mean something. They're fundamental to the subjects. But right now there's a good dozen subjects that we as animals cannot understand without a lot of help. And I think that those metaphors, I think, are central to helping people to understand what's actually at stake.
No, so that's a beautiful message for everybody, because you guys are working on those things, and they're increasingly important. We're more and more of a visual culture, which is nice, but yeah, getting big ideas, big across visually or spatially is crucial. So I don't know whether that's a segue to
Q&A.
I think that's right. That's
yeah, let's
perfect.
do it.
Okay, all right, let's do it. So, questions from all of you, from any of you? We have this mic actually.
or comments.
And it doesn't have to be anything we've discussed so far. It can be an entirely new topic.
Yes, okay.
Thanks. Judy talked about, or asked about, other philosophers and artists, and it made me think of Derrida and Deleuze. And so I wanted to start with Deleuze, who called maps blueprints for action, not just tracing, and wondered what are the missing maps for human thinking, in your opinions, and what are the blueprints to thinking that we often fail to see them for what they are?
It's where Deleuze, I think it was, it would refer to maps as blueprints for it wasn't action, was it?
Human action.
For human action. I was wondering if there were other forms of analogous visualizations that we think are worth making, worth considering. I will say that one of the things when I'm working on this project now is that there are a discrete number of likely dystopias, likely gruesome ends that we might come to. I'm sure you can all think of them. This is a good place for a tree diagram, because you should really backwards engineer the line of causality that can lead to all of these outcomes that we would like to avoid. Because if you can, in a very disciplined way, consider all of those causes, and the causes of those causes, you can get down to the root causes that lead to those problems. And you can begin just pull out your axes and like how can you attack them at the root? Again, this comes from nature. That notion of attacking something at the root is straight out of nature. But that's a form of visualization that I don't think that we do. I won't say much more about it, but it's a huge subject. This is one of those cases where I'm going to choke on my own word balloon trying to get it out. But I do think that some kind of a flow map of some sort needs to be devised in order to attack those unthinkable ends that our species might be coming to. Just see if we can go all the way back to their root causes. I don't know. That's one. That map should exist.
Thank you. We have another question. Please.
Hi. So, sorry, I might want to read it out because I noted it long ago. So much of today's discussion is focused on abstraction as a way of representing cognition and spatial reasoning. I'm interested in something called affect theory, which is, it argues that some experiences are felt before they're consciously interpreted. Do you think visual abstraction can communicate affect in a way that's universal as maps and comics? Or does that become very culturally specific if it becomes emotional?
Yeah, I think, Yael, you may want to also summarize that as well, because there's a lot of reverb back here, so we're...
Can you summarize it?
Yeah, it was difficult. I just want to make sure that both Barbara and I can give a proper answer.
Can I
I think Judy's going to give it a shot.
Would that be helpful? Okay, so the question is about, if I was tracking, about affect theory and ways in which we can visually communicate emotional experience, or that a way that we present information can have an impact that's felt before it is consciously understood. And there's a question about, either methods or strategies for achieving that, as well as how universal those, how consistently we can hope to achieve that kind of emotional impact in viewers, or how culturally specific it might be.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of work on emotion and feelings on language. And I don't think language adequately captures it. And there, I think, some of the drawings that you guys showed earlier, there are nuances of facial expressions, body expressions, that sometimes artists get better than people who are using words to describe them. And again, we're picking them up from each other very quickly, most of us. We can misinterpret. But I can't help but thinking that again is a way that visual communication can help. And there are two sides of it. Of course, it's how can I express, and then is there a visual image that will, an emoji, they're too crude, but one of those things that will express my emotion better than words can, and then also communicate. So there are both sides to that. And I guess the other thing is emotions are incredibly ambiguous. I remember research done years ago on children confusing sadness and anger on the part of other people. So you're raising a fascinating topic, but that I don't think is easy. because often we're unsure of emotions, our own and others. Does that at all resonate with what you?
Yeah.
And sometimes over-clarifying can be a problem.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
But I just wanted to add that earlier you touched on the ways in which the more sort of pre-verbal a reaction is, or a stimulus is, the more universal it is. That it tends to be more widespread. If it comes from nature, if it comes from something basic within us, then it tends to be true across cultures, whereas when you're speaking of language, language tends to evolve differently in different cultures. Now this is true to a degree with things like facial expressions, for example. There are some fundamental expressions that tend to be fairly universal, and then there are expressions that are socially geared, and they're more like dialects, and they do tend to be more specific in different cultures.
Well, in some cultures, you're not supposed to show emotions.
Yeah.
So I get those questions on gesture too, and obviously for everything, there are cultural and there are more universal. And again, I think explaining how to get from here to the train station is everybody's going to use gestures. So it's in other contexts maybe less so, but yeah. I mean, it's like asking, is it inherited or acquired? Both.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have many more questions.
I will try to be quick. Thank you guys so much for being here. Barbara mentioned that we're in an increasingly visual culture, and Scott showed us the interesting depictions of how to escape from a fire and icons like that. And my question is, do you think that our visual culture is getting worse, like due to capitalism and the enshittification of products and any other reasons that may be happening? Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, good shout out to Cory Doctorow there. Yes, obviously it's tidal. I mean, there are some sectors in which things are getting worse. There are some in which they're getting better. There's obviously a great deal of backsliding happening right now. Money and power do have a way of corrupting certain processes, reversing some positive trends. But one of the nice things about knowledge, the dissemination of knowledge and discoveries is that even though they may have to go to sleep for 1,000 years or so, generally they're not lost entirely. And every time a meaningful discovery is brought to the fore in communities like this, someone's going to make sure that there's not just one copy in the Library of Alexandria. They'll they'll upload it to something. Hopefully not just the blockchain, but yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I think I'm a conditional optimist. I would like there not to be those irreversible losses. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
I have a quick. Yes, hi. I have a very quick question. I do apologize. English is my second language, so I'm trying to enunciate as best as possible. So I appreciate this. I have a kid who happens to be on the autism spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
He is neurodivergent, and actually one of the things I always wonder specifically is, have you basically used the kind of research you two have been doing in terms of how people who are neurodivergent perceive reality?
Mm.
Because we basically have a conversation specifically in terms of how people who happen to be a non-autism spectrum be able to perceive reality, and when I'm talking about autism, I mean deep on the spectrum. And I often wonder specifically, what's your take on this, specifically in terms of the type of research you guys do?
I have a fairly specific answer to that to start. I will say that about a month ago I received a letter from somebody who'd read my book from 2006, Making Comics, where I actually spoke about the emotional expressions, 6 or 7 primary expressions that are recognized around the world. You know them, anger, joy, etc. And the ways in which they can mix, very much like colors, to produce other emotions, such as like joy plus anger creates cruelty, for example. And a person wrote to me who was on the autism spectrum and had difficulty in recognizing facial expressions in social contexts, and found that that was actually useful. And I'd heard that from programmers in Vienna who had created an app where you could have a little mixing board for emotions. And they had told me years before that they had also heard similar things. My daughter is on the autism spectrum. Quite frankly, most of my readers are on the autism spectrum. My kids tell me I probably am too. That's usually how it goes. You diagnose your kids and then they diagnose you. But yes, those, obviously, we call it a spectrum because, of course, neurodivergence, it's many, all the colors of the rainbow, it's so many different experiences. But those who are in that world, there usually is a path to understanding the things that they truly need to and want to understand. And I've at least seen that one little isolated example of somebody who found a path to understanding something that was socially useful for them.
So, and it's not just facial expressions, it's tone of voice, intonation, and body movement. There are so many channels that we use for communication that can be misunderstood. And to a great extent, they're correlated, which is somewhat helpful. So if you lose a modality, you can compensate for another. I mean, we talk about the paucity of language and the richness of visual, but from a novel, we can imagine, or many of us in the room can imagine a whole set of scenes. And then when you go see the movie, you say, no, they did it wrong. And I, on the whole, won't go see movies made from books that I like because they're going to do it wrong. So, I mean, there is a aphantasia now where people can't have visual images. I suspect that anybody at SIGGRAPH does have them, but again, I could be wrong. But the variability across people, across modalities is interesting. Again, we have redundancy. It helps us against error.
Right, language on the page is supplemented by memories and imaginations. Language in person is supplemented by intonation, by gesture, by expressions. You get so much more information, but they're synchronized. Barbara and I, as we're speaking to you, our gestures and our expressions are synchronized to our words. A lack of synchronization is why I think most PowerPoint presentations put us to sleep, because what's on the screen often is not synchronized to words. So I'm a real snob when it comes to that sort of thing. Although everyone here today did an excellent job, I will just say.
We have 2 more questions,
Thank you for all the interesting comments. Maybe my question is sort of similar to what Barbara just said about movies and going to see them and going, oh, they did it all wrong. I wonder with visual communication, broadly, you could maybe say visual language as a particular way of talking about that here. The question of how much people agree about what's being communicated, which I think is one of the very nice properties of like written, spoken, symbolic language is it tends to be sort of a reinforcing process in a community where we get more agreement generally about the meaning of these words and symbols. And it seems like for visual communication, one downside of it is that we tend to drift more in the meaning of some, maybe not all of it. So I'm sort of curious about that. Do we have more private languages, in a sense, visually, in some ways, but then also the fact that it's derived from the spatial world and sort of functional considerations, it may be more constrained than written or spoken language?
Well, if I can begin, I will say that one of my central conclusions, in large part from reading Mind in Motion, but from other things as well, is that you have to sort your metaphors, put your metaphors into two boxes. There are what I call rhetorical metaphors, where you've chosen a somewhat arbitrary symbol. Like how the Japanese will have the little bubble of mucus coming out of the nose when you're asleep, or blood shooting from your nose when you're sexually aroused. Okay, those are regionally specific, right? We don't have that here. But when you're using spatial metaphors, those actually come from nature. When Google had me explain how Chrome worked before Chrome even came out, this was 2008, and they accidentally released my comic 4 days before the browser, but that's a whole other thing. When they had me do that, I had to talk to their engineers for a really long time to get a sense of how that piece of software was built in order to explain it. And I could have made up a lot of rhetorical metaphors. I could have had some pirate character from SpongeBob saying, "Arr, matey, the browser is like a sailing ship, and the cache is you know, like their cargo hold or whatever." But the thing is that all of those, they would have been throwaway metaphors. But when I did things like, you know, understand that yes, each tab was its own separate process, the central spatial metaphor was one of separation and containment, even though those tabs were appearing right in front of each other, right? So it's like, the thing about those metaphors, the spatial metaphors, is I didn't have to invent those. I had to discover them because they were fundamental. So when you're speaking of drift, rhetorical metaphors drift. Rhetorical metaphors are local. Rhetorical metaphors belong to particular cultures and particular communities. The spatial metaphors are fundamental to the system itself. You know, like the three branches of government here in the US, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. That's fundamental to the way the system is wired. You need to discover that as you're finding out about how things work. So those are not temporary. They don't drift. They're actually basic, and they're fairly universal especially when describing complex systems. Something that we need to get a lot better at, I think.
So I'm gonna this is aside a bit, but I think those metaphors are powerful. Just as visual images can be powerful in changing things. One of my favorite examples came from Sid Mukherjee in the New Yorker article. He's an oncologist who writes for the New Yorker on and off. And he said, the way we've understood cancer is it's a war, a battle. And there's an enemy invading and we have to kill it. So I hate war metaphors altogether. I think they bring enormous harm. And we should avoid them if possible. So he said we have to change the way we think about cancer. Cancer is a seed. A cell, bad cell comes in, it tries to implant. You have to spoil the soil. So that comes from nature. I mean, they both do in some sense. So the way you treat the cancer is by making the environment around it uninhabitable. And that, I think, that view changed cancer research to looking at the environment for the cancer. I mean, the point is, many of us will die with plenty of cancers. They didn't kill us. So sorry, that for using. So metaphors can be really powerful, and I think politicians pick their metaphors.
They do.
Yeah. So it's something to think about, and I'm glad you're thinking about it in a general way. Yeah.
Indeed, I think that's a beautiful place to end. Let's thank both of our speakers again. Thank you so much for participating.